Good morning, everyone. Welcome to StormGeo's Severe Weather and Tropical Weather Outlook. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Dave Gorham, Senior Meteorologist on the Client Services team and host of StormGeo's Weather Webinar Series. I'm here with your presenter today, Chris Hebert, plus Sarah Borg, one of our summer interns. Glad you're here with us, Sarah. I also have Derek Ort, one of our tropical meteorologists, tweeting for us this morning. So thanks, everybody, for being here. During today's presentation, we're going to talk about the current state of the tropics. We've already had Tropical Storm Ana. What does this mean, if anything? Other questions include, how far off is our next storm? It will be Bill. How strong or how weak is El Nino? And what about the coastlines? Are some areas more at risk than others? For answers to these questions, our guest this morning is Chris Hebert. Chris is the chief of our Tropics Watch team and senior hurricane expert at StormGeo. I'll tell you more about Chris in just a moment. But for those of you unfamiliar with StormGeo, let me tell you about who we are. We are StormGeo. You may know us as Impact Weather. Impact Weather was acquired by StormGeo in 2012. And just this past April, we fully changed our name to StormGeo. New name, same team, an expanded team, actually, considering the scope of the global StormGeo. So let me tell you about StormGeo. StormGeo serves as the specialized weather department for hundreds of corporations worldwide, providing tools and services for clients to protect their people, assets, and bottom line when faced with weather-related challenges and threats. As a 24/7, 365 days per year, full-service weather department, our team of meteorologists and business continuity experts offer site-specific forecasting and modeling, weather alerts, and business continuity tools that are custom configured for each client we serve. We're here to serve the oil and gas energy, banking, insurance, retail, manufacturing, healthcare, petrochemical, hospitality, and the construction industries, as well as many others. The StormGeo group serves 5 main areas globally: offshore, onshore, media, renewables, and aviation. You can find more information at stormgeo.com. If you have any questions during the presentation, use the question box under the GoToWebinar platform. We're also using Twitter to help you get the most out of this presentation. Just log into your Twitter account and use the hashtag StormWebinar so that you can ask questions, share ideas, and discuss the outlook with our team of Impact Weather. Whoops, I knew I was going to do that. It's StormGeo. It's not Impact Weather anymore. StormGeo experts and other like-minded professionals, which includes you. As I mentioned, our presenter today is Chris Hebert. Chris is well known to our clients as well as being a minor celebrity on the Hurricane Conference Tour that takes place each time, about this time every year. In fact, Chris is on airplanes and on the road quite a bit, in his car as well. We don't see him much around here. Chris has been the chief of our Tropics Watch team and in-house hurricane expert for many years. He's been with this family from StormGeo to Impact Weather and our former parent company, Universal Weather and Aviation, before that, all the way back to 1981. Chris, you're clearing your throat. I think you're ready to go. I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Yes, I'm ready, Dave. Well, let's get started. And the first thing I wanted to take a look at is just how quiet it's been out across the Atlantic Basin over the last 10 years. I've looked back through the 1850s for any longer period of lack of major hurricane activity impacting the United States coastline, and I can't find anything even remotely close to just the 10-year period we've gone through from 2005 to present without a Category 3 or higher hurricane striking the United States coastline. Of course, we had Hurricane Sandy, which was weakening a little bit, just barely a hurricane when it approached the coast of New Jersey a couple of years ago, and that certainly caused major damage, but it was only a lower-end hurricane at its peak there as it approached the coastline. So it's been quite a long period of time. If we look back toward the last 160 or so years, the longest period I could find without a Category 3 or greater strike on the United States coastline was back in the 1860s and again in the early 1900s after the 1900 Galveston hurricane. We had a 5-year period in both of those cases without a Category 3 or greater hurricane striking. So you just have to understand how unusual this is to go so long without a strong hurricane striking the United States coastline. Now let's take a look at what's happening out there today. Before I go to that, I want to tell you about the last hurricane that did strike the United States coastline as a Category 3. We had Wilma. That was in October 24th of 2005. All right, well, let's take a look out there. What we've seen so far this year And it's getting to be the middle parts of June now. We've had one tropical storm form. It actually formed from a non-tropical feature off the Carolina coast in early May and moved into the Carolinas. It didn't cause a lot of problems for them, but it was the first storm of the season. We've already had one. What's going to happen the rest of the season? Take a look out there now. Our daily briefing from today shows a couple of disturbances. One of them, disturbance number 5, is moving in toward the southern Caribbean Sea. Not a lot of activity associated with it. It's a tropical wave, and conditions in its path not generally favorable for development, but we'll keep an eye on it because some of the models are indicating a little bit of surge in moisture coming out of the western Caribbean Sea into the Gulf in the next 3 or 4 days. Take a look at it on the loop here, and this is a water vapor loop, and we can see tropical waves on here, and I'll point over here toward the wave that's approaching the Caribbean now, and you can see a little bit of rotation. There it is right here, moving across. It's approaching just east of Trinidad, a little bit of rotation. It's pretty far south, though. We'll keep an eye on it as it moves westward across the Caribbean Sea over the next 3 or 4 days. Now, some of the model guidance, this is the American model. This is indicating perhaps a weak low pressure area developing by the northern Yucatan Peninsula on Sunday evening. The greens shaded areas and yellows are wind speeds. So we see 25, 30 mile per hour winds coming across the Caribbean Sea, strong trade winds. We have a strong high pressure off to the east of Bermuda. And those strong winds will be moving into the Gulf, pumping a lot of tropical moisture into the Gulf of Mexico by early next week, which will certainly bring some rainfall into the region. And the American model indicates maybe a weak low-pressure area might try to form. As we move forward toward Tuesday, it has a very weak low-pressure area moving into the upper Texas coast with plenty of tropical moisture streaming up into the northern Gulf Coast. At the very least, we'll be looking at some enhanced rainfall chances next week along the Gulf Coast. The European model is not so bullish on any development. It does show the increased trade winds on Sunday, as we're seeing here. A little bit less than the American model, about 15 to 25 miles per hour. And by Tuesday, no low pressure area approaching Texas and 15 to 20 mile per hour winds, pretty much normal conditions out there. So it's a little bit of a disagreement in the models, but since we do have that disturbance 5 that's moving in toward the Caribbean Sea now, that moisture will be moving westward, and it'll be around the Yucatan Peninsula come Sunday evening. I think we need to keep an eye on things, maybe just a slight chance that something might try to spin up in the western and southwestern Gulf of Mexico during the early to middle parts of next week. Let's talk about El Nino and what's happening out there in the tropical Pacific. You've heard about El Nino and La Nina out there. I've talked about it many times before. And an El Nino occurs when we have a warming of the tropical Pacific over here in the to the west of the coast of South America and Central America. When the waters warm up there, we tend to have more storms developing in the East Pacific. The air rises in the East Pacific and tends to sink in the Caribbean Sea and tropical Atlantic. El Nino also produces increased wind shear conditions across the tropical Atlantic, which is an unfavorable environment for development. Well, what's happening out there in the East Pacific right now? Let's take a look. Very warm water, well above normal temperatures from the coast of South America all the way west to the date line, and that means we do have an El Nino that is currently in progress. Last month, we were looking at the forecast, and this is the forecast of the Pacific temperatures. The red shaded area is the El Nino region, and the blue shaded area is La Nina, a cooling of the Pacific. Current conditions here are a little bit about between 1 and 1.5 degrees Celsius above normal. The forecast from last month was up to over 3 degrees Celsius above normal, which would be one of the stronger El Ninos on record. The current forecast is now indicating a little bit less than that. We're getting to be about 1.2, 1.3 degrees Celsius above normal in the tropical Pacific now. The forecast is by August, September, October, somewhere around 2 degrees Celsius above normal, which would be a quite significantly strong El Nino, which should be a significant inhibiting factor as far as development this season. If we compare the European model's forecast, and that's what we're looking at here, the European model forecast, those red lines are just the various ensemble members of the European model, and I've also plotted on that some of the stronger El Ninos of the past. 1997, the one in blue here, is one of the stronger El Ninos, and the European model is forecasting something not too different from 1997. There's a pretty big spread as we get here toward the latter parts of the fall, but generally it's forecasting a rather strong El Nino, and I think that's what we're going to be seeing this year. We also have to look out into the tropical Atlantic and the Atlantic Ocean for clues as to what might happen this year. As we look toward the eastern Atlantic between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, we see well below normal temperatures in that region. Below normal temperatures also in the Caribbean Sea, but we do have some warm water across the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeast U.S. coast. Now that's important because water temperatures can govern how much or how strong hurricanes can become. The deeper and warmer the water is, the stronger the hurricanes can become. The Atlantic goes through cycles of warm and cool, which last several decades. We call that the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And we can take a look now at what's happening out there in the last 65 years. The red shaded areas are warm cycles. During warm cycles, we tend to see about 4 or 5 major Category 3 or greater hurricanes per season. And during a cool period, as last occurred from 1970 to 1994, we average about 1 to 2 Category 3 or greater hurricanes per season. As you can see now, if we look toward the end of the graphic, we're way down here. The Atlantic has cooled down. The big question is, are we moving back into another cool cycle, a less active phase of the oscillation? And that's a good question. But let's take a look a little bit farther back, all the way to 1878. And we can see those warm cycles typically last from 2 to, in many cases, up to 4 decades, from 1926 to 1969. That's a 44-year period, a warm cycle. Now look where we are now. This is the annual temperatures out there in the Atlantic region where we look for that oscillation. We're right here. And if we look back toward the previous warm cycles, we can see there were times when the water in the Atlantic cooled down to cooler than it is right now. So there's not a guarantee that we're moving into a cool cycle just yet. I think that if you look at some of these previous episodes here, or for example, around 1950, it cooled down here below what we're seeing right now, then sprung back up and was a warm cycle for another 12 to 15 years. Same thing happened in the late 1800s. We saw a cool period for a few years, and then it warmed back up for another 15 or so years. My guts is saying that I think we've probably not moved into that cold cycle yet. I think we're going to have another 10 or 15 years. I think that over the next couple of years, we'll see the Atlantic warm up again, but we really won't know that for another couple of years. It's hard to tell when we're moving back into a cool cycle. We'll have to let it play out for another few years, and that will determine whether or not we've moved out of the active cycle. Now, this is a graphic which combines some of the charts I showed last time for the last webinar and the current forecast from the European model. The European model has done very well in forecasting high pressure and dry air in the tropics. Last year, it forecast about 70% normal activity last year, which was very close to normal. And the May forecast down on the bottom graphics indicate high pressure all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to Africa and dry air in the same region. The June forecast, which is 2 panels on top, even higher pressure from the Gulf of Mexico to the coast of Africa and dry air. That's in the mid to upper levels, that dry air. We have high pressure that's going to be strong over the tropical Atlantic. That means sinking air and dry sinking air across the region makes for a very unfavorable environment for development in the deep tropics this year, and that's still looking like that now. We're looking at the last month. I just plotted this graphic today. This shows the mid-level moisture up around the 15 to 20,000 feet up in the atmosphere, very dry between the coast of South America and the coast of Africa, but you can see just over in the southeastern Caribbean Sea where that disturbance 5 is moving right now, it's an area that's not been too dry, and that's why we're seeing a few thunderstorms flare up with that tropical disturbance right now. But in general, across the basin, not very good conditions for development out there. Still very dry. Speaking of dry air, not just at the mid-levels, but also near the surface in the lower few thousand feet, we have to look for that dry Saharan air again this year. Last year, we had some very strong outbreaks of Saharan air. That dust moved all the way across the Caribbean, even into the southern United States at times last year. Particularly big outbreak in early August last year. Unusual to have one that late in the season. But right now we have a stronger Bermuda high. We have dust moving off the coast of Africa. Not a big outbreak of dust out there right now, but it's to get an idea of why it's hard for tropical disturbance to organize in that kind of an air mass. That's what one of these dust clouds looks like over the water. This is a shot from a reconnaissance plane last year near Barbados, just east of the Caribbean Sea. And that dust is in the lower few thousand feet. It makes it very hard for hurricanes to get going in that kind of an air mass. The European model also forecasts seasonal activity in all of the basins. And the forecast for this year, and we're looking at that area circled in red here, the Atlantic, the orange bar here is normal. The green bar is the forecast, and we're talking about accumulated cyclone energy, which is a measure of energy across the basin released by hurricanes. We look at the intensity of the hurricane and how strong it is and how long it lasted at a particular intensity to calculate that ACE level. And the European model forecast 70% normal last year, and that's exactly what it was. This year's forecasting about 50% normal of that accumulated cyclone energy in the Atlantic basin, which means it's forecasting a relatively quiet season. And this is from July through December, and the hurricane season goes through November. If we look in the other basins, we're seeing about close to normal in the Eastern Pacific and a little bit above normal in the Western Pacific. But if we take a look at what's happened so far this year, and I find this interesting that last year and the year before, we were talking about the accumulated cyclone energy being well below normal in all basins. Well, this year, there's definitely a change out there across the rest of the globe. In the Eastern Pacific, well above normal. We're at the ACE of 40 now, and normal's about 4. The Western Pacific is well above normal. We've already had 2 super typhoons in the Western Pacific. So we're well above normal with cyclone activity around the world so far this year. In the Atlantic, we've had that one storm with not very much ACE with that. But compared to normal, we're looking at the Eastern Pacific 1,000% of normal right now. We usually don't see any strong hurricanes out in the Eastern Pacific so early in the season, which is a sign that we have that strong El Nino developing. Plenty of warm water. We're getting a more active season in the Eastern Pacific. And the Western Pacific, 350% of normal. Last year in the middle parts of the summer, they were about 50% of normal. So it's certainly a big change across the Pacific as it begins to heat up with this El Nino. The European model also predicts seasonal patterns of movement and development across the tropics, and it's basically saying that in those areas where the air is going to be sinking out here between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, and where the air is going to be drier in the mid-levels and as well as the low levels, we're not going to have too much activity out in that region. Systems coming off the west coast of Africa will probably be struggling to develop east of the Caribbean Sea. And finally, one other tool that we can use to estimate the type of seasonal activity, where storms are going to develop and how many might develop, is what we call looking at for an analog season. We're basically looking at the conditions in the Pacific now. Is there an El Nino or a La Nina or maybe neither? Looking at the water temperature patterns in the Atlantic basin. We're looking at jet stream flow patterns across the United States and across the tropical Atlantic. Try to find a season in the past that's similar to what we're seeing out there right now. And we've identified some of these seasons here. Mostly you can see that there aren't many storms developing. From 1965, one of our analog years, only 6 storms. The most in any of the seasons with a similar setup was about 8 storms in 1991, which did feature a Category 2 Hurricane Bob striking Long Island in that year. For the most part, if we look across the Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico during these analog seasons, we don't see a lot of activity, certainly not through the Caribbean Sea. If we look to the Gulf of Mexico, we do see an occasional hurricane in there. We had Betsy in 1965 that struck Florida and then the southeast Louisiana area, very significant hurricane. Hurricane Agnes in 1992 developed in the southeastern Gulf, and a couple of days later moved up into the coast of Florida, caused extensive flooding all up and down the East Coast. But otherwise, not a lot of activity in the Gulf. There is one other season that is an analog for this year, and that is 1957. It's a fairly good analog. There were 8 storms that year, 3 of them hurricanes, 2 of them major hurricanes. We didn't have a lot of intense hurricane activity in the Gulf of Mexico. We did have one, and that was Hurricane Audrey. Notice nothing really in the deep tropics here, nothing in the Caribbean Sea. And that one Hurricane Audrey developed very quickly on the 25th of June. On the night of the 26th, 27th, it developed quickly into a Category 4 hurricane as it approached Louisiana. It did weaken before landfall, but it killed over 400 people in Cameron Parish. Not a lot of warning back then in the 1950s. We didn't have satellite back then to see it forming early on. The computer models hadn't been developed yet. So it was kind of a surprise that it strengthened and moved inland so quickly, and that caught a lot of people there in Louisiana as it moved ashore. So that's one of the seasons with a similar setup. Let's take a look at what we're expecting for the season. And the map there shows in blue the areas where I think they have a significantly lower probability of being impacted by any significant hurricane. We're not talking about a weak tropical storm. We're talking about more significant impact here. I think the deep tropics across the Caribbean Sea toward the coast of Africa will remain relatively quiet. The one area that might be even close to normal, and still it might be just a little bit below normal, may be the western tip of Cuba there, southern Gulf of Mexico. We might be looking at some development, and possibly the northern Gulf Coast. We've seen those analog seasons feature a storm developing either in the northwest Caribbean or southeastern Gulf or in the middle of the Gulf. So I think that's a possibility this year. But the prime area is going to be here off to the east of the U.S. coastline and north of the Caribbean Sea. I think we'll see development out there. Is the east U.S. coast going to be impacted? Typically, in a stronger El Nino, we have a trough developing along the east coast, as they had all winter long, bringing them those winter storms at the northeastern United States. If that is there, then those systems should curve on out to sea. But if one happens to form while that trough is located a little bit farther west, we could see an impact on the east coast like we did in 1991 with Bob, although chances there are still below normal. The other area we have to watch is going to be in the Gulf of Mexico. Think about it. When those storms or those disturbances move off the coast of Africa, they have a hard time getting organized as they cross to the tropical Atlantic. When they reach the Caribbean Sea, it's still rather hostile. But once they reach the Gulf of Mexico, the El Nino's influence is not as strong there. We don't have the stronger wind shear there. We don't have as dry of air in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have to watch for those close-in developments like Audrey in 1957 or Agnes in 1972, and typically when they develop, they give about 48 hours notice from the time they develop to the time they move inland. So we do have to watch for that. I think we're going to see about 8 total named storms, 4 of them hurricanes, 2 of them Category 3 or greater hurricanes this season. And as we look toward the names for this year, we've already had Anna out there. I expect we'll get to about Henri and possibly up to Ida. That would be 9 named storms, but I think we'll be definitely below normal in terms of the number of storms. But just remember, just because we're forecasting a less than normal as far as the amount of activity this season, it just takes that one hurricane like Audrey in 1957 or Betsy in 65 or Agnes or Bob or any of those storms that formed in seasons with very little activity in general. Just that one storm can make for a very bad season for you. And that's a look at the outlook for right now, and we'll turn it over to Dave and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Very thorough presentation, and I know you talk fast, despite the sign I put up there that says speak more slowly.
Slowly. I kept looking at it.
But don't worry, the presentation is recorded, so you can listen to it again and try to catch up what Chris says so quickly.
Slowly.
A couple questions. The California drought, an El Nino situation will bring that southern storm track to the south, and that can mean more rain for California. Can you ask or talk about that?
Yeah. Typically, El Nino's impact on California occurs more toward the fall and winter, and it does look like this El Nino would be fairly strong come fall and winter. That would signal a southern storm track that may be very active for California. The good news is that they're going to get some significant rainfall likely come fall and winter. The bad news is that it typically comes all at once along with a great deal of wind, and that could cause some damage to the California coastline. And previous strong El Ninos that have some pretty powerful storms moving into the California coastline, causing mudslides, landslides, and plenty of flooding conditions across the area. Unfortunately, their drought might be punctuated by some flooding conditions by the late fall and winter of this year.
Yeah, and even flooding conditions might not, likely won't alleviate the drought situation out there. It'll take years to address that situation. Another question concerns Hurricane Wilma. Hurricane Wilma was in October of 2005, 10 years ago. The question is, when was the last major Category 3 hurricane to strike the U.S.? Well, that was Hurricane Wilma in 2005. But how often do we usually see major Category 3 or higher storms hit the U.S. coastline?
Well, typically, in the past, we've seen major hurricanes strike the United States coastline. I believe about 1/3 of them that develop strike the United States coastline, historically, about 30%. But in the last 10 years, we've had quite a few major hurricanes develop, but none of them has struck the United States coastline. Very unusual. We typically get a Category 3 or greater hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico about every 2 to 3 years. And it's, again, the last major hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico was the G-storm, and what was that one, Derek? Gustav in 2008. Forgot it for a second. Moved north of Cuba, but moved into Louisiana as a Category 2. It's been very, very quiet. Carl was south of 20 degrees north. We don't consider that the Gulf of Mexico, though. So, yeah. So it's been very quiet out there.
Statistically, the fact that we haven't had one since 2005 means nothing. We could have one this year. We might not have next year. It's unrelated to what's happened in the past.
No,
but still something to consider.
Hurricanes don't have any memory about where they formed or didn't the previous year. So just because we didn't have one last year doesn't mean we can't have one last year. And just because you've gone 20 years or more without one doesn't mean you can't get one this coming year. The chances are always just about the same.
Our last question, it says, you mentioned several analog years, but did not include 1992, the year that Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida, an early season storm that was just like now. Or what do you think? 1992?
Well, it's not maybe a weak analog for this year. Conditions aren't quite exactly the same as we saw in 1992. But again, we were looking at a weaker to moderate El Nino in 1992, 93. And Andrew formed during one of those, and it was, I think, only 7 or 8 storms that year, and that was the only significant impact on the United States coastline, which happened to be a Category 5 hitting southeast Florida, and then a Category 3 or 4 striking the United States coastline. So it just goes to show, just because it's going to be less active in terms of the number of storms out there, you still have to pay attention and you still have to prepare.
Right. Whether it's 1 storm or 10 storms, the 1 storm could be the one that changes your life or affects your business. Thank you, Chris. We're going to wrap it up. That's the end of our questions section. Don't forget, we will record this, or it is recorded, and I'll send out the link to the recording in the next couple of days if you're registered. Derek has been tweeting. I have been tweeting. Log into Twitter and check hashtag StormWebinar for all the information that we posted there. Additional questions, please don't hesitate to email Chris. Chris's email address, chris.hebert@stormgeo.com. And after the webinar concludes, we have a brief survey, post-webinar survey. Take a few minutes to help that or to answer that. That always helps us out. Our next webinar is scheduled for August 11th, 10:30, just like today. I think August 11th is a Wednesday. Oh, it's a Tuesday. Good, August Tuesday. So do sign up for that. You can go to stormgeo.com, check the news and events, and if it's not there today, it will be there as soon as I can crack the whip on somebody. Let's see. Don't forget, you can follow StormGeo on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, any of the social media, latest updates and announcements about our webinars and other events. And as a reminder to our clients, you can receive the latest news about potential weather threats as they develop by way of our personalized weather website, which will grant you access to our exclusive videos, forecasts, models, and alerts. If you're not a client and would like to learn more about how we can enhance your business continuity plans through our site-specific weather forecasting and risk mitigation best practices, please contact us by emailing sales.houston@stormgeo.com, and an industry manager will be in touch with you shortly. On behalf of all of us here at the new StormGeo office in Houston, I'm Dave Gorham. I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Until then, have a safe and productive summer season. Stay cool, stay dry, stay safe. Bye-bye.